I'm Meteorologist Rod Hill, and welcome to my winter outlook for 2023 and, of course, into 2024. I've been doing these winter outlooks going back to the fall of 2000, developed a passion for it. I've had some success in what we predict. In fact, last year, the big item that we nailed was that we correctly said if we're going to get a big winter storm, it was going to come the back half of February, and that happened to be true. Now, I do want to show you some video clips. This one is from an El Nino year. I'm looking at some what could be familiar years to what we're looking at this year. December of 2009. Enough ice in the gorge that we shut down 84. The gorge was closed. Pretty good ice storm into Hood River. Here's the second clip. This is December of 2015. And this was that battleground tornado that went in the books as being one of the strongest tornadoes ever to hit our region. It was an EF1. It had 104-mile-per-hour wind gusts. There were reports of at least some damage to some 36 homes from that storm. Pretty unusual. And then this last clip, also from that same December of 2015, we had some flooding in Vernonia, but the worst of it was actually up in Klamath, and that's what we are showing you here. And as we come back out, again, those were all El Nino winters. This is going to be an El Nino winter. So you're looking at what past El Ninos have produced, and you're trying to find averages that support conclusions, okay? December 15, particularly interesting to me. Notice I label it as a wild card month. El Ninos have a stereotype of being kind of quiet in the Northwest, mild, often drier than normal. But yet December of 2015 turned out to be the wettest month Portland has ever had in the record books. Over 15 inches of rain came down that month. We had the flooding we showed you. We had the battleground tornado. It was also a cold month. It wasn't mild. It was roughly 4 degrees colder than normal. Which is also kind of an outlier for El Nino. So I'm going to come back to that phrase I like to use, wild card, in just a moment. This is the report card of the main points I made 1 year ago. So back the first part of November a year ago, we projected a colder than normal, we projected a mild, a warm November and December that would be wet. This was the only thing I really missed last winter. Instead of it being a mild November, December, it was cold. In fact, December turned out to be about 4 degrees colder than normal. It was wet, so we got that right. But then moving forward, we said in November, January would be drier than normal. It turned out to be about 50% of normal precipits. That was a good call. And then I mentioned this earlier. This was the big feather in my cap from 1 year ago. I said if we were going to have a big winter storm, it would come the back 2 weeks of February into the first days of March. So in other words, in November, we said if we have a big winter storm, it's going to come in somewhere in this 2-week window, and we hit it on the bullseye. It was February 22nd that Portland put 11 inches of snow into the record book, and it was also came with cold weather. We had a record low on the 25th of 18 degrees. So that's what I'm trying to do, is at least give you a good heads up for some of the more important, bullseyes of this coming winter of what we expect. I mentioned it's going to be an El Nino winter. If you, this refers to El Nino, by the way, the water temperatures off the coast of South America. And for El Nino, they're warmer than normal. So you see the red temperature information down here. That's warm Pacific waters off of the coast of South America and the equatorial waters. This is a typical El Nino flow pattern. Again, all of these INSO cycles, La Nina, neutral, El Nino, they all have their kind of stereotypical flows. This is the one for El Nino. You get an active southern jet stream that can produce very wet winters in California in terms of rain. You can have flooding rain issues in the Gulf Coast states into Florida. For the most part, the cold air that comes out of Canada drops across the upper plain states into the Great Lakes, leaves us alone. Now, that December I showed you of 2015 did get some of this cold weather, but typically in El Nino it stays away from us. And we end up being not only mild, but pretty dry overall. There was a lot of talk with this El Nino back in August. August is typically the month, as you know, that you start hearing different forecast agencies and individuals put out their winter projections. And at that time, there was a lot of hype on social media and other news sites, for that matter. This is going to be some sort of a super crazy El Nino like we'd never seen before. A bunch of overdone hype, because if you look at the information, that's simply not true. To even be a super El Nino, you need water temperatures off that coast of South America to average 2 degrees Celsius or above. This is where 2 degrees is. This spaghetti chart of all the different weather modeling never even approaches 2 degrees temperature is what I'm trying to say, 2 degrees temperature Celsius. all of these different weather models end up in this +1 to +1.4 Celsius range, and that's a moderate El Nino, not some super monster strong El Nino, okay? Now, in the black center of these next several graphics, you're going to see basically some data that I came up with for points that I think are important that I based my winter outlook on, okay? So if you go back in time since 2000, the 3 El Ninos that were moderate, that closely reflect what this strength of this El Nino will be, were the winters of 2002-3, 2009-10, 2015-16. Again, 15 was that outlier with that cold, wet, rainy December. But if you just look at the months of November through March, the rainy winter season for us, 13 of 15 months were above normal. 13 out of 15. In other words, practically every single one. So that would make me as a forecaster tell you there's high confidence that overall this will be a very mild winter in terms of temperature. If you just run the averages of these 3 comparison seasons, January comes in super warm, +4 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, and February about the same. And in fact, 4 out of the 5 warmest winter seasons Portland's had on record since 1950, 4 out of 5 were El Ninos. So now we have a lot of past information to lead us to believe that this in fact will be overall a very mild winter. Now, what about snow? Everybody really wants to know about snow, right? Again, the same 3 years, if you run the averages on these, Portland comes up with anything from literally not a single snowflake, no snow, to as much as 3 inches in any given season. So 0 to 3 obviously would not be a snowstorm. It would be a winter with no snow, or maybe 1 3-inch event, or maybe a couple little dustings to half of an inch, that type of thing. What I find interesting is I do find an increased number of freezing rain events in El Nino seasons. So in other words, I'm telling you, if we're going to have a significant winter storm, it's far more likely it will be freezing rain this winter and not snow. Now, what about total precipitation? You know, it's important we get a good water year, right? I told you that the stereotype for El Nino, and the data supports it. If you go back to 1950, most El Ninos are drier than normal. But there are El Ninos, including that month of December of 2015, that were not only wet, but they were crazy wet. And I find when I look back through the decades, there are enough winter seasons of El Nino that had incredible spikes of high precipitation, high water, that I'm not going to project total rainfall. I just think it could go either way. So is it going to be, you know, an average year, a drier year, a wetter than year? I don't have any confidence to predict that one way or the other. I hope that makes sense to you. I also found this. There seemed to be an increased number above average winter El Nino seasons where you had several of these south wind events, not huge windstorms, but windstorms of 50 to 60 mile per hour winds in the Willamette Valley that produce wind warnings, and you can get power outages and that type of thing. So that's something else that we're going to be keeping an eye on. Back to precipitation for a moment, because dry weather is always a concern when you're predicting an El Nino season. And in fact, if you go back to 1950 is when we started keeping tabs of was it an El Nino, La Nina, or neutral system. That's how far those records go back. So if you go back to 1950, check this out. The driest water year Portland's ever had was 2000-2001. That was the La Nina season. But all the rest of these dry years were El Nino. So absolutely a heightened concern that this could be a dry season. So we'll keep an eye on that. Now, here are my absolute conclusions. This is my winter outlook, if you will. We went through a lot of research. We told you the results of the research. Here are my conclusions. Highest confidence I have as a forecaster, it's going to be a mild, above normal winter in terms of temperatures. I'm projecting that in terms of being above normal for any particular month, December, in fact, will go on to be the warmest of the bunch. And think about that. If it's a really mild December, what do you think is going to happen to snow levels in the Cascades? They're probably going to be fairly high. So that does set up a slow start to the ski season as well over the holidays, potentially. I have March as normal, but I have all the other months, November, December, January, February, above normal. I talked about no confidence for me to predict total precipitation. We talked about, I don't think we're going to have a snowstorm, but I do think if we're going to have a winter event, it will be freezing rain, not snow. So that's going to be a big sticking point when we look at my findings, 6 months from now. What about Mount Hood? Well, typically El Nino years for snowpack underproduce. The average for El Nino, 76% of normal, underproducing. I ran the averages back to 2000, and I come up in El Nino seasons. Mount Hood snowpack measured the end of April, 74% of normal. That doesn't mean it's going to be a bad recreation season, but I do have that concern I mentioned a moment ago. How about Ski Bowl, 20 inches on the ground, 4,000 feet base for Christmas Day, and maybe far less than that at government camp? I have a concern that there's not going to be a lot of snow into the holiday season, but then we'll eventually have some decent snowstorms as we get going into January and February. That is my winter outlook. I remind you, we also have an extended version of this with Drew Carney that's posted on some of our KGW platforms, and you can read digitally on the KGW.com weather site as well. Thanks for listening. I'm meteorologist Rod Hill.